Welcome to Pitch Your Firm. I'm your host, Marc Howard, and today we have a very special guest, Nate Saperia of Saperia Consulting. And I'm going to let him introduce himself. I'll just quickly give a little blurb, but it's so much more. It's like tip of the iceberg compared to what Nate has been through. He's with nearly 20 years in finance, 50% as a consultant, 50% as an operator, head of FP&A, VP in finance, ex-managing director of Accordion. Nate, welcome to the show. Take it from the top, and why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Mark, thanks so much for having me, and it's great to see you again. That was a pretty good introduction. Like you said, 15 years plus, almost 20 years in finance, half as a consultant and half most in internal finance roles, most of the time head of FP&A or VP of finance. My last 7 years I spent at a consulting firm called Accordion that focuses on advising the office of the CFO within private equity on their strategic finance team, which is very FP&A focused. The interesting thing there is I also did 50-50 there, 50% advising external clients and 50% internal running FP&A and business intelligence, where I scaled the firm through 2 rounds of private equity investment. So it's not exactly an accounting firm, but it's very close. And PE investment and also the CFO consulting kind of preceded PE investment in accounting. So we see a real correlation there.
Great. I guess before we get to the deep questions, maybe just start off. You post a lot of great content. I think one recent article you put together is on like the whole new open AI deep research. I thought it was a great article. Scary. There's a scary factor that's going on in the industry now. There's a lot of things out there. Google Gemini has a competing service as well. Maybe just talk about that a little bit. Do you see this as like a threat to professionals such as yourself, or what's like your takeaway from that?
I don't personally see it as a threat. No, I use AI all the time. I know that's very controversial, but I think of it as you have an analyst, you have an associate. They're usually doing 90% of the prep work. I think of AI as my analyst, my associate that does 90% of the prep work, but I have the expertise. I'm going to tell it now it's wrong on this. You got that wrong. And that's why I did that article, particularly on a topic I know very well, where I could go in very quickly say, it's not right. You didn't get it right. So I think of it as that relationship, let's say, between a managing director at a consulting firm or investment bank and junior resources who are doing most of the heavy lifting with expertise from the top.
Yeah, and who knows? Maybe we'll have this conversation a year from now. I won't be speaking to Nate. I'll be speaking to Nate AI. The industry is moving pretty fast. We'll see. Let's kick things off because I want to talk a lot about what's going on in the industry, M&A, acquisitions. And we were talking a little bit on the pre-show, right? And it's hard to make generalizations, right? Because it depends on the firm size, the revenue, the capital structure, the acquisition terms. So maybe we start really generally. I think in an earlier email, you mentioned firms should seek partners and not investors. And I really like that. Maybe we can kick it off with that. What do you mean by that? And maybe we can start with an intro into sort of the world of acquisitions.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I want to clarify is private equity is used very generally, but there are a lot of different buckets. When I think private equity, we think majority investment with a lot of leverage, what we call a leverage buyout. But there are lots of other options, such as growth equity, which is a minority investment. It's somewhere between venture capital and private equity. And there are also a lot of family offices out there, which are even smaller. So very wealthy individuals, families doing similar private investments, but on a smaller scale. So there can be a right size for everyone across that. I don't necessarily think private equity is good or bad. I think it depends on the situation, and the choice is different for everyone. When I say partner, I make a distinction between an investor and a partner is still an investor, but one who can also act as a mentor is having weekly discussions with the CEO and CFO, bouncing ideas back and forth, really open dialogue. And I would say if you're starting to have conversations about a potential investment, one of the things, a red flag is if they're not talking much about your talent and they're focused purely on financials. On the flip side, if the first things they're doing are interviewing your entire C-suite and going down another layer and really saying how they want to be a partner and that a lot of the investment dollars, capital going in, it's not they're not there to cut costs. They're actually, a lot of times, they're there to increase expenses, increase investment in talent acquisition, increase investment in talent improvement, and really just provide support. Talent is everything. So that's a partner, and that's someone who knows the industry and knows how to make a firm successful.
Now, just in terms of maybe just being a little more concrete, can you perhaps give us some examples of how do firms typically deploy capital that they would get either through a PE or a family office or some other mechanism?
Yeah, so the main areas that it gets deployed are into technology. That's obviously a huge focus in the industry, and I don't think anyone has it totally figured out, to be honest. I think we're going to see a lot of trial and error, but there are some firms that know more about technology than others, some investors, and that can be a major plus.
What are
Uh,
you seeing on the technology front, though? Are you seeing, are we talking like software, upgrading, gutting systems? What's the factors in tech?
Yeah, it's all of the above. Most private equity firms, especially when they're investing in first-time ownership, they're going to want to upgrade your technology stack in the back office, things like ERP, RM, and HRIS, HR information systems, payroll, et cetera, in a way that it supports new client acquisition as well as allows people to focus more on delivering to their clients instead of spending a lot of time on mundane tasks. That's what I mean on one side. So that's internal investment, but also focusing on extending service offerings to technology enabled two different ways. One is really tech-enabled service offerings, whether it's automation, AI for better insights, or just tools that help the team function more efficiently, providing a way to ingest clients' data more efficiently instead of doing manual. So on the technology side, I'm seeing it on every front.
Yeah,
I think,
and it
go ahead.
seems like a lot of playbooks I'm seeing, and traditionally it seems like with particularly with PE comes in, it's a lot of, and maybe this is a myth, you can correct me on this. It seems a lot of times folks think that it's a matter of like cost cutting. Who are we going to ask? What are the things we're going to chop off the block? And what you just said a second ago, it's interesting because it sounds like there is another playbook, and it's one in terms of efficiency. You don't have to cut the team to be more efficient. You can, let's just say, squeeze a little more out of each person, but there is a conflict in that. Obviously, we don't want folks going from 60 hours to 80 hours, right? So I
Yeah.
think there's a play in there with technology that can optimize a lot of inefficient things, systemize the processes. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there, but I'll try and be brief. I think it needs to start with a brief history of private equity. There was a period where it was solely focused on cost cutting, and that was like the 1980s, the 2010s. And 2010s through 2020, interest rates were so low, private equity firms really didn't actually have to do tons of stuff to make money because multiples were expanding. They could buy and sell it for more just because valuations were exploding. We're in a period where interest rates are up, multiples are coming down. So private equity firms really need to create value operationally now. And that in I see the opposite, at least with a good partner. They're spending more, not less. They're providing money, so they need to put it to good use. And I've seen it in areas like expanding the internal talent acquisition team, expanding the internal talent development team, making sure training, just putting money to work to make sure you have the pipeline of the next generation of leaders. The other area is putting capital to work to use more on equity ownership across the firm, to be able to give not just partners in equity ownership in the firm, but your next generation of talent. So just below partner or junior partner, giving them a stake in the company to really align incentives. And yes, the private equity hold period is fast. They target 3 to 4 years. Right now, we're seeing longer time periods than that. But the flip side is that if you have that equity, you're seeing monetization of that equity quicker. You don't have to wait decades to see money come out. And you're even seeing it within the hold period as they can distribute money out to partners and shareholders, even within the hold period. So you could be having liquidity events every 2 years under private equity ownership.
Yeah, and I want to talk about like the whole succession angle as well. But before we get to that, I also want to talk about right now it's really hard for a lot of firms to understand that there's so many different components of this, right? Now, in your experience, are you more on the buy side or sell side in terms of acquisitions or a mix of both?
For the majority, I tend to come in right after an acquisition has occurred, or sometimes I'll get pulled in during an acquisition by a private equity firm that says, we're acquiring this firm. We want them to be set up for success once this deal closes. So let's go in, help educate them on how we think about things and how they may be ready to get on the ground running on day one in a way that isn't quite as overwhelming, and really not act as someone who's trying to institute rules and procedures, but again, act as a partner, help understand what the private equity firm is going to focus on and why, develop some of the systems and the metrics and KPIs that will help them with what the private equity firm is going to need. And I'm in a unique position where I've been on both sides of this. I've been a head of FP&A, I've been a VP of finance at private equity backed firms. It can be a lot. It can for sure be a lot. And you might not always understand, but also having been an advisor, I at least to think I understand both sides and can hopefully translate the why and how it's going to be beneficial for these firms long term, assuming you get the right partner. I don't want to lean too much on private equity is perfect. There's a lot that's not perfect, but I do want to give the view that there can be major benefits. So at least consider it.
Yeah. And one of the things about this show, we love to dive into the details. Can you maybe walk us through a recent example without naming names, but giving as much detail as possible, like a recent transition that you've assisted with? Because I think what the viewers want to know is it's one thing from a high level perspective, but what are like some of the gotchas that most folks just don't end up knowing until it's perhaps too late?
Yeah, so I have my newsletter, the Barefoot Back Office, and why I call it that is a lot of internal finance functions at consulting firms and accounting firms. They have a ton of finance expertise, and that finance expertise is being used to advise clients as it should be. But what that means is that there isn't as much focus on the internal finance. So an example is I was brought in by a private equity firm who had an acquisition closing in the middle of last summer. It coincided exactly with their fiscal calendar close, and they were working through a budget. And they they didn't have to have as sophisticated budgeting and planning processes in place prior to institutional ownership. But when we're talking an institutional ownership of 3 to 5 years, you break that down. You start at the top. What's your 5 year plan? Then in that 5 year plan, year one is your budget. And it, that gets broken down not just to financials, the KPIs that actually drive the financials, and understanding the operational levers that leadership can pull to create value. So in this example, I was brought in pre-close to help the team with that process and get it a little more ready for where it would need to be once the firm took over ownership.
Okay. And were there any particular gotchas or surprises or things that you felt either party should have known before they came on with you that they did not know, or was it pretty much smooth sailing?
I don't think there were any gotchas and surprises. It doesn't matter the industry. First time institutional ownership it's a transition for everyone. So I go into every consulting firm in the space goes in thinking there's a lot we're going to need to explain. One of the major ones is just thinking in terms of key performance indicators or KPIs, things like utilization, margin, tracking tracking items like cross-sell and upsell, particularly as accounting firms add client advisory services, client accounting services, their CAS practices. That's something that firms are very focused on. It's a huge area for growth. You have these recurring customers or reoccurring. They may not have a formal contract, but they're coming back every year for audit and tax. And they don't actually know that there's other ways that your firm can provide value. And your firm is in the best position to provide that value. They already know your financials, they know them deeply. It doesn't take them any time to get up to speed to offer more strategic insights on top of that.
And what are the top KPIs you try to track or watch when it comes to, let's just say, in the instance of increasing valuation?
Yeah, so of course, utilization, when people think professional services firm, they think utilization. That's, of course, it's highly important. People also think of it as a bad word. They think that everyone's always trying to increase utilization and make people work more hours. In my experience, it was a balance. We would get worried if utilization got above our target because that means burnout, that means turnover, and that's extremely costly. And you can't grow if you're losing good people. So that's obviously one of the key metrics. But another key one is project margin. And this means how much revenue are you getting in versus the cost expended by your employees on that project. And one thing that's really important is setting up a deal committee, a deal review committee before each project and projecting out what the project margin will be for that project. Make sure it hits a hurdle rate, track it through the project, see where you may have done better, you may have missed. And that's the key to maintaining your profitability.
And do you have any particular numbers that you like to recommend? So for example, let's just say utilization rate. Maybe you come in on a deal, come in on a transaction, and let's just say the average utilization, let's just say, is 80%.
Yeah.
Some may think that's high, some may think that's low. So what is your job at that point? Are you saying, hey, look, I think we can get these guys to an average of 85%? Or are you saying, hey, 80% is fine. Let's see if we can squeeze out of somewhere else. Or do we look at another metric? Do we look at pricing? It's not about increasing utilization. It's we can actually handle this from the opposite side where we can increase prices in certain aspects. So how do you do that, move through that dance to understand? Because it's not like you're tracking just, it's not like a whack-a-mole kind of thing where you're nailing one KPI and another one is popping up. You probably work through I don't know how many KPIs. So do you maybe walk us through, do you come in with like this master KPI worksheet where you say, okay, guys, this is where we are now. This is where we need to be. and like working on a game plan from there? Maybe give us a little juice on that.
Yeah, for sure. That's exactly right. There should be a master KPI worksheet, and it's not just saying these are the names of the KPIs. Get really deep on how they're defined because they can be defined a lot of different ways. You know,
Hmm.
the industry standard on utilization is to use a 2,000 hour year as the available hours, but
Sure.
that's not always the case. I've seen 2,500. I've seen different variations. So it you then need to adjust your target utilization based on that denominator, but just make sure everyone's aligned and understand that. Um, and then on the target utilization rate you choose, that's really going to vary depending on firm. Some firms are incredibly focused on work-life balance, so they're going to have a lower target utilization rate. Some firms are very focused on maximizing revenue, and they're going to have a higher target utilization rate. And the employees who come to these firms should also be aligned. That's their goal as well. And you should have compensation packages that align to that. So there's not going to be one number that's right for every company. It's going to vary by company. How do you use that information? It really comes down to your hiring plan. If you're over your target, you need to find ways to bring it down so you don't lose good people. So that may be hiring. That may be, okay, is it extremely high in one practice, but lower in another practice? And is there an ability to cross staff to one, people don't like sitting on the bench. So can they help out in another practice and even pick up some new skills while doing that? And then for the practice that is really high utilization, they're super happy for the support. And what that does is that also allows you to balance your utilization across the firm, to balance your revenue. If you're constrained in one practice, okay, can you actually expand the revenue capacity of that practice by cross staffing? So it opens up a lot of doors. People think about growth in terms of just revenue, but it's a people business. Growth is about revenue growth doesn't happen without people growth. And finding that balance is completely based on knowing your utilization target and let's adhere to this and get there.
It's similar to, I'm thinking of the like a presidential inauguration. You get elected, you're in place, the game starts, and now it's okay, what is that 100-day plan? So if I look at it in terms
By the
of
way, I'm not going
that,
down the presidential path on this podcast.
yeah, of course. But what I want to say is just what I guess the analogy I want to make is that 100-day plan kind of thing, right? Because that's
Yeah.
where most eyes are on you. And I love numbers, I love stats, I love KPIs. We could talk about those all day. There's ways that you can manipulate KPIs as well. One of the things that I like to see in any kind of, whether that's an acquisition, new leadership, are the low hanging fruit that can be tackled first because I see a lot of time spent, money wasted, wheels spent on all these kind of nice to haves. Maybe they're hard to track, maybe they're hard to get them to a certain level. Do you have any particular like focus or like low hanging fruit that you can say, okay, guys, let's because at the end of the day, you want to show progress, right? And if I'm waiting 6 months to see progress, I'm starting to question the whole thing. So, what are the low-hanging fruits that you come in? Are there any particular KPIs that you feel like you can improve faster, sooner rather than later?
Yeah. So number one, I would say make sure you have one good junior to mid-level internal finance resource who's incredibly good with tech. It's amazing how much you can get done with the tools these days that cost like Power BI costs $10 a month. Power Automate costs $10 a month. You have one good, let's say, 28-year-old who knows those tools, and you can actually get all your data out of your systems, put it into a data cube extremely quickly, and get actionable insights. In terms of KPIs to focus on in the first 100 days, I would go back to that project margin and make sure everyone understands what that means. Make sure there's a process in place to approve or not approve deals and how much negotiation you're willing to do with a client on pricing to keep to that project market. The final thing I would say, it's not necessarily a single KPI. It's more about making sure leadership and the entire firm understands the KPIs, understands their importance, and is aligned on them. That's something I see pretty often is, maybe your CFO knows them pretty well. A partner in a different region might not understand them and say, these aren't important. I know how to run my business. And that's true. They've done a great job running their business for a long time. But to take that next step of what private equity expects, you'll have to have buy-in from everyone that we're on the same page about these key performance indicators and where we need to be. And if we deviate off course, how are we going to get back on course?
And it must be difficult working with, particularly if there's multiple partners, because it's some partners may, you may come into an organization and you're like, look, the average partner hours is maybe something like 40 hours a week, where these partners should be not on the billable hour wagon. They should be focused on growth, thought leadership, other things, business development, more value add. So is one of those metrics is to initially like track what is the average partner hour, billable hour, and how can we get those as close to zero as possible so you're more running a business almost as an investor versus just working in the business.
Yeah, 100%. Partners should be focused on business development, and that's going to take them training up their team on leading engagements at a lower level than partner. I think it's also an important point to make that one of the biggest transitions in institutional investment is that transition from distributed decision making, a lot of partners, not no centralized decision making. Under private equity ownership, that decision making is going to become centralized, and getting people to understand that, and second, everyone being on board with that, all the partners being on board with that. Because if a large portion of your partners aren't on board with centralized decision making, it's going to be tough, and maybe it's not the right setup for your firm.
So let's just go through a typical engagement for you, Nate. Let's just say where so you come into an organization, maybe just start at the top. I guess the big question is how are you paid, and how are there any sort of factors, success fees or anything like that? Kind of how does that dynamic work out? Are you retainer based? Is it hourly fee? Are there bonus success factors? Are you paid on a particular KPI level? Walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so I mostly operate on an hourly fee basis. My time is my time. I'm not there are benefits and considerations to a fixed engagement fee. My personal view is in these situations, there's very little you can know in advance, and committing to be able to get something done in a certain amount of time for a certain price isn't in anyone's best interest. So I would work on an hourly fee basis, but the most important thing is open communication with your stakeholders. And usually the two key ones are someone at the private equity firm, whether that's an finance operating partner or a VP or principal from the deal team, and then the CFO. And having weekly touch points with the private equity firm and the CFO together, and a few times a week with the CFO, and just be upfront. This is where we are. This is where initially, before we had all of the information we thought we were going to be. Does this mean less time, less money? Does this mean more time, more money? And are you guys okay with it? Are you people, you investors and CFOs, are you okay with it? And just be open and honest and have a discussion, and hopefully one that builds trust, and hopefully two, everyone can be reasonable and on the same page about the value that's being created. So I don't generally work on fixed fee or success fees, particularly because I don't do as much transactional work
Mhm.
where the work has, there's a clear milestone of what success is. So for me, I like the hourly rate. I'm not doing a lot of fractional work right now, but at some point that a retainer would make sense in that scenario.
Now, I want to bring the conversation to where we first started because we were talking about cool things like AI and deep research and
Yeah, the fun stuff.
Nate AI and all that good stuff.
There will be
The
an
re
AI.
There
Maybe
will
I'm
be.
out
Hey,
of the job.
yeah, that's going to be our next show, and you're going to get retainer from that, and that'll finance you hopefully. But in reality, and the reason why I wanted to circle back to that is because I am seeing a lot of productization in the industry, right? I'm seeing a lot of services turn to products, and this is something that I'm absolutely fascinated by. That's my background, turning services into products. I've done a lot of those, but I want to talk this through, and you might not have an answer for it maybe today. Maybe this is food for thought, but pretty much all of your services, and I think similar to other folks in your industry, is it's mostly hourly based, right? And you're not to be compared with an accounting firm where a lot of folks are doing subscription based pricing or recurring pricing. It's a kind of like a different kind of thing because, as you said, it's hard to put a fixed price on something that has a lot of moving pieces, and that totally makes sense. That's the reason why the accounting industry isn't. A lot of folks are still on the billable hours. But in your particular case, and maybe this is more of a thought experiment, is there anything that you can see yourself eventually productizing, turning into maybe a bespoke service? And maybe it's not like that big kind of, okay, this is Nate and this is like my 80-hour usual hours retainer kind of thing. This is
I
maybe
hope
a
that's
service
not
that
per
I,
week.
hey,
I hope
you tell
it's
me.
not 80 per week.
Yeah, but it's so is there anything like a smaller service that you can see as like maybe a product or even some sort of like assessment that you think firms
Yeah,
are actually willing to pay for?
that's exactly right. Assessment is the first area. An assessment needs to be done no matter what. That's the first thing I do when I come in is essentially an assessment. Maybe it may be informal and I give an informal readout, but when I come in to do my job, I have to assess your people, process, and technology. So that's a clear product that can be productized and will be productized. Right now, I'm doing it a bit more informally, but I do plan to offer an assessment of people, process, technology, and that would be a 2 week process. So that's a very good call out. In terms of what I do personally, every situation is so different. I don't think I can come up at this time with a product beyond that. That serves as the basis, the roadmap for the rest of it in engagement, assuming past the assessment, the company wants to continue. But for a lot of firms, productization makes a ton of sense. There are services like building a data cube that if you know the technology up front, if you've seen the data, that can be productized and should be productized. And that's in the best interest of everyone. One, because the firm can do it more efficiently, which is beneficial for them from a margin standpoint, but also it'll bring the price down for the client if it can be done more efficiently.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of movements in the consulting industry in terms of productization. It's all about really the reason why a lot of folks aren't doing products right now is because of that billable hour and that whole idea of scope, right? If scope can be pretty much de-risk, then essentially that can be a fixed product, right? And yeah, we'll have to talk offline about this. There's definitely a few things I can see in your case, besides that Nate AI that you're going to be cranking out as a product, hopefully by next
I'm gonna
year.
have to I'm gonna have to pay you for your ideas on my services.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
We'll work something out.
I want to circle back to the other thing where I also mentioned talking about like succession planning. I think in some of your writings, you put a lot of great stuff out there on your blog. I think you mentioned something about one of the big movements right now is like this whole ownership works thing. I'm not very familiar with them. You praise it. What is this all about, and why should folks be curious about this?
Yeah, I feel incredibly strongly about this one. This is not something I expected to see in the industry, but what ownership works is it's a consortium of private equity firms, mostly private equity firms, that have committed to make progress on expanding equity ownership in their portfolio companies to employees at all levels. And look, there's no better way to align an employee's incentives, drive, willingness to stay with a company than for them to have an equity interest in the company. And it's a very novel concept. You know, maybe it's not as shocking in a consulting firm or especially in a SaaS firm, a technology firm, but you think of like industrial services, you think of manufacturing where you have more, I don't want to use the term blue collar, that's not right, but a lot more less highly compensated roles. These firms are saying we want to give ownership down to everyone in the firm, to every level, no matter what they're doing. It's going to get them excited about what they're doing. It's going to get them more productive. It's going to make them feel like they are valued by the company and that they're going to benefit from the company's success. And isn't that what you want your employees to, the mindset you want your employees to have at the end of the day? Again, I was very surprised by it when it first came out, but it makes so much sense to me.
Love that. Hopefully, the viewers can check that out. I think it's a very fascinating concept. I'm starting to watch that as well. I wanted to show with more on like where you see yourself, your firm in 3 to 5 years. Might be a big question. Or maybe it's like the same old. It's working great for you now. Where do you see yourself?
3 to 5 years. The work I do, I'm always talking about 3 to 5 year plans.
There you go.
Maybe I should be
Back at you.
more. Maybe you're telling me I need to keep hold myself to the same standard. So for background, I started the firm towards the end of last year, September, October. So still in very early mode. One of the things I realized very quickly, and some very nice private equity firms were very blunt and told me I was going out offering everything I could do in every industry. And they came back and said, that doesn't help me. That doesn't help me at all. Tell me the two top things you can do for me. And that made me really focus. And that's how I ended up focusing on professional services and focusing on aligning value creation planning from the private equity firm to how can we make this operational with the newly acquired portfolio company. So my plan now is to focus on that. And 3 to 5 years after just having started a few months ago feels very long, but you're right to call it out. I should give myself the same advice that I give to my clients. So appreciate that feedback.
Yeah, no, and just to be really clear, if of all the folks that are watching this, it sounds like you do a lot of things. And just to your comment a moment ago about laser focusing on what you do best. Who's the ideal person for you, Nate? For the folks that are watching, describe the perfect client that you're looking to pick up right now.
Yes, so that would be CFOs are my main target point. I realize not all accounting firms have a CFO, so whoever is, if it's the managing partner who's overseeing finances, if there is not any institutional backing yet, I can help them talk through what are their priorities, what do they care about, is institutional investment the right path for them or not? It's not necessarily a yes. So that's one type of client. Another is a firm that's in the process of being acquired. I can both give them some guidance on what it's going to look like, what the first 100 days are going to look like, what longer term is going to look like, things they can get started on before the deal closes to give them a head start. And then finally, it's firms that have been just acquired and ready to operationalize a value creation plan. So generally, that's at the CFO level. For firms that have a CFO, if the firm does not have a CFO, usually the managing partner.
And are there any particular size firms that you work particularly well with in terms of FTEs or revenue, or how do you do that?
I've worked with firms ranging in size from 25 million in revenue to 4 billion in revenue. And shockingly, the needs aren't all that different. Below 25 million, hiring consultants gets pretty expensive. I do a fair amount though of just one-on-one, like an hour or two here. Can I help you just think through things? So below that size, that's where I could be helpful. And even initial consultations, 30 minutes, I'll talk to someone for free. And maybe I can even give some help in that time period for firms under the 25 million.
Wow,
So
30 minutes for free.
but
I might end up calling you, Nate. So
let's
yeah,
do
that
it.
sounds
Let's
like a
agree
that
right
sounds
after
like a
this.
great deal to me. Nate, this has been great. How can folks get in touch with you if they want to learn a little more or follow you? What's
Yeah,
your contact?
I, I'm very active on LinkedIn, so follow me on LinkedIn. I'd love that. I have a newsletter that I'm putting out once a week. It's called the Barefoot Back Office. That's again referencing how the internal finance team is often overlooked at these types of firms, but how value add it can be and not just be a cost center. So follow my newsletter. And those are the two main areas where I communicate with my audience. Yeah, and feel free anyone to send me a DM. That's a lot of how I communicate these days. So those are the main ways to get in touch with me to keep up with what I'm doing. Probably pretty similar to you, Mark, although I don't have a YouTube channel. So maybe I need to expand into that area.
Baby steps. We'll get there from YouTube to all the other things. Nate AI. I think you're gonna have a great next 3 to 5 years. So, well, Nate, thanks so much for being on the show. It was a pleasure to
Thanks for
have you here.
having me. It was a great conversation. I appreciate it.